Hello, and welcome to Echoes, a sumo history podcast. I am Nathan, and I am joined by my two collaborators, co-host Jake, who I will go to next.
I'm Jake of Grand Sumo Breakdown and Iowa Sumo Club. Sumo history fan, and Nathan's been keeping us in the dark. I'm excited to see. I don't even know the topic of today, so I'm very excited to get into it. And for the record, the reason I was giggling there when we got back to us, I got new headphones, and listening to that just absolutely awesome theme song. It's like when you first got glasses and you didn't know you needed them, and then suddenly you can see the world. That's kind of like what I'm hearing right now.
Yeah.
Big upgrade for me, and I don't have any clue or excuse on why I didn't do it years ago. Those old headphones were not very good.
But they had a sticker on them.
They did. I mean, I got more stickers. I'll put that's no problem. But it was a stupid reason to put off buying good headphones for, my second job.
You just dazzled your headphones and didn't want to upgrade?
Yeah, I got like a pile of 100 stickers. Like, why was I hanging on to that one? Whatever.
Wow.
I am going to need more stickers. I'm just
well, I think you and I will be seeing each other in a couple weeks, and I can get you some stickers then.
Ah, great.
Oh, yeah, so I'm Jake. Right, we're doing intros again, sorry.
And I am JJ Jones, Drinking Athletic Brewing, a proud sponsor of the SoCal Open, the 2025 SoCal Open.
Yeah, I didn't get to watch it live, but I've been catching up here and there, and it looked like a great day.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're filming this just a few days after, and JJ hosted it, and it was awesome, and it was exhausting for everybody.
Nathan told me, we're lucky that we're doing this on Wednesday because you haven't had a voice for a few days. Is that right, JJ?
This is true. And I was making fun of Christina's voice, who was a lot worse. She sounded like Forrest Whitaker from Rogue One.
Oh, man.
One seems to lose one's mind. What color? That's just what she sounded like the whole time.
Really? I was there.
I love that role. I always appreciate roles when you can tell that the actor is like dicking around and having a blast doing it. And that's one of them for me. He was having a great time doing that stupid voice. Honestly,
I think Forrest Whitaker has more of those than not. Last King of Scotland, he was just like
hamming it up.
He was like, "Let's go!"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. How do you go crazy with the tyrant charisma? Yeah.
Speaking of our topic for today,
actually,
is the Last King of Scotland, the famous Forrest Whitaker movie.
Yeah, we're going super rogue on this one, off topic. Okay, sorry. It's going to be my job to bring us on topic. It's usually my job to chase squirrels, but okay. So I didn't say kind of what my role here is, but this whole episode is really kind of built around that. So I'm doing most of the research for this podcast series, and this particular episode is going to be kind of meta. So in past episodes, JJ's talked about, hey, I like how we have this nice narrative that we can follow. And, JJ's told me don't have slides just full of text. And this is me just going, I think, no, I'm just going to do my own thing. And so I have not told Jake and JJ at all what the topic is, what's going to happen, because I want them to kind of have the emotional roller coaster of my research process on this particular story, because this one has been a emotional roller coaster, and it really kind of summarizes why I like studying history myself, not just kind of like reading history books, but kind of doing the research.
Okay.
And so what I ask from both our audience and you guys is trust. Hopefully we get somewhere awesome. If not, JJ will have a hell of a time editing this in post to try to make it something.
Oh, I'm just gonna throw it out raw. I'm not editing anything. You started this up. I just a little bit behind the scenes. I went in and I just started moving things around just a little bit. Right? I changed some colors or something. And immediately I get a text hey, what are you doing?
Get out of the outline.
Okay.
I'm just worried that, like, after all this buildup, like, did Nathan do all this research on sumo just to get us trapped here, and now it's going to get weird or something? Like his one off the wall conspiracy theory that he's been building our trust over the last 5 episodes to get to.
I'm
It
not
was
that
the Lizard
sophisticated.
Illuminati. It's always been the Lizard Illuminati from the beginning.
Yeah, well, if it is a true surprise, I'm impressed at my confidants who I've reached out for help, and I was like, "Hey, I'm working on this. Might you be able to help?" And just so people know, I do think this episode will lead to a future episode. If I'd had other people who were able to find other things, like where we kind of run into some dead ends, they haven't been able to find stuff. But there's enough story and I think intrigue here and mystery that we can run with it. So
love it.
That being said, so the title of this episode is the Sumo Taikan. So the next slide, and it's going to follow 2 people. And so if you could go to the next slide, it will explain and start the process of why we're going to go to this. So this slide basically it's talks about how the Northern California Sumo Association has commissioned a book that will be a sumo encyclopedia that includes a history of sumo in California.
Wild. Which feels like immediately I'm like, oh, I see that Nathan probably tore heaven and earth apart looking for this book.
Yes. So right away, I'm like, wait, because like I'm already like weeks into doing this research when I first run across this. And so right away, it's like, so does that mean I don't need to do anything else? Like I just find this and then I just like share it with people like, hey, I found this cool thing. All right, guys, we're done.
Let's just record Nathan reading this on air, and there you go, project done.
Wow, that sounds like a terrible audiobook. Terrible audiobook.
The fact that this is its whole episode, though, I have guesses of where this can go, but I'm going to go ahead and go way out on a limb and say that this book is not as complete or as easy to find or even existing as much as you hoped.
Yes, because we're like 5 minutes into this and like, all right, we're done with the series. We've already taped a bunch, but we're just, take those down because we found this, right? We don't. And we were wrong about all those things. Yeah. So like, if you guys run across this, like right away, they're like, wait, what's your reaction?
Well, if it existed, I don't think you would have hidden it from us for this deep into the project.
And if you did, it would have been amazing.
Yeah. You're much more manipulative and secretive than I realized, Nathan.
Yeah, that's not my forte.
No, I guess I'm thinking that something went wrong, whether it was I'm curious if is it because of World War II that this fell apart? Is it because of the classic every hobby has this where like if a certain couple individuals lose interest in something, then projects evaporate. And I understand that's the case. That could be related here. But yeah, I think the story is going to be 1, how did Nathan look for this book? And then 2, did he find the story of why it doesn't exist?
Yeah. And I wish I had answers to some of those. You're on the right track.
Okay.
So one thing at the very bottom of this one, it's old, copied stuff, is it says who the 2 people are who were involved in this project, the editors and compilers of it. One is Keisuke Takahashi. Okay. And he is an Issei Gyoji, a veteran Issei Gyoji. And I think I've made passing references to him before, right? Yeah. And then another guy, Shigeru Nagata, who I'd never heard of before I saw this, who is a San Francisco journalist. And so this is going to be a book that they're going to commission, and it's going to go out to the members of the Northern California Sumo Association. So my process when I am like, I'm just scrolling through all these newspapers and, after I do these keyword searches and I find this, and then the next thing I do is like, I start writing down the details. And one of the first things I do is I write the date down. So Next
I was
slide.
going to
please.
ask, that date probably I see is not on here. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Damn it.
December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor.
Oh.
So it's actually even worse than that, because if you look, that's the stamp day that it was like put in their like catalog
Yeah.
at Stanford
Down.
Library.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's
No.
actually December 7th. Oh, okay.
Oh, that. I don't have any words, just different timbres of groan.
Yeah.
For the people that are listening, yeah, it's Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a day that
May or may not live in
something
some sort of
around.
infamy. Yeah.
And JJ's, Jake's voice is muffled because his hand is literally like over his mouth. And
Yeah.
he's having to hold his head up because he's like, oh, jeez. Yeah. So this was my like, oh, God, this did not, like right away, this did not go anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, that's my first thought.
Oh
Like,
God, that answers like 30 to 40% of all the questions I had on this.
yeah. So, but this is what I love about looking at history and doing the research, yourself. Like, yeah, you talk to other consultants, you read stuff, you try to get context and background, but being able to do it yourself. Because then, like, step back a little bit beyond the date and kind of look at some of the headlines on this paper.
Brink
Right.
of agreement. Yeah.
Right. There's articles here about more Nisei being drafted into the army, right? There's articles about the peace or the attempts to avoid the brink of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like it's kind of madness, right? And then if you could go to the next slide, it kind of connects the kind of corners of that page. It's a whole lot of text. So it's really just looking at the headlines. There's headlines here about, negotiations to avoid the war breaking down, kind of third party government ministers making statements about negotiations, talking about Japanese citizens starting to evacuate New York City. Like, Marines being put on alert, throughout the Pacific, right? And keep in mind, like, if this was published December 7th, 1941, the deadline for all these journalists to put in their articles was December 6th, 1941. It gets published overnight.
That's right.
It shows up on people's doorsteps Sunday morning, December 7th. This is the paper people are reading
When they're hearing like the radio probably being their first announcement of the breaking news that morning.
Yep.
How many hours off is Hawaii from California? Just I guess
3
I'm
or
not
4.
familiar.
Yeah, I think it's 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
morning there is like, yeah, you're well into the mid morning for California and all that. Everybody's awake. Everybody's man.
Yep. And I mean, I know it's like bad for, especially for audio podcasts, because like I had this experience too. I'm like, just was sitting there stunned, like looking at this stuff, because it really challenged, even as obsessed as I've been about World War II and the connection and conflict between Japan and the US, right? For most of my life, the American narrative, right, is it was a complete surprise, right? Like, it was a complete surprise attack. People did not see the war coming. It was just a shock. And I think clearly it was a tactical and strategic surprise. Clearly the US wasn't prepared. But the Japanese American community, the Nikkei community, and their papers, their coverage knew the storm clouds were brewing, right?
Oh yeah.
Like in that community, there was tension building already, right? And you can see it in these papers. And so that really kind of reminded me of just well, and just that feeling of like sitting on a knife's edge of between deadline and publication, and when people are reading this, their world had just completely fallen apart.
As much as this newspaper, as much as like the top half of all these headlines have to do with the international, at this point, economic conflict, even those articles, let alone everything below, are immediately irrelevant to 100% of the people reading this paper.
Exactly. So, like,
Especially the one down in the bottom left right there.
right, right, the sumo hook, like, right, exactly, and that also just puts in perspective, like, how much this is, to me, an interesting story, and we've talked about it a little bit, of, like, a core sample, like, just following I don't know, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It was, like, it was something that I don't know if anybody else is a big Wire fan, the show The Wire,
Oh,
one of
yeah.
my favorite shows. There's this one line, and I don't even know if it's in the show or if it's in the commentary because I'm that obsessed. I watched it multiple times with all the commentary.
All
Um,
right, you win this contest. That's
no,
fine.
no, I just love it. But like somebody says, like, you know, you follow the drugs, you're going to find drug users and drug dealers. You follow the money, you're going to find you never know where it's going to go. And I weirdly kind of feel like just picking the sumo story and following the sumo story is just seeing where that leads is leading to stuff like this, like these kind of realizations about history and what it felt like to live there, just like a little bit, you know,
Mhm.
in a way that I wouldn't have if I weren't doing this, right?
Yeah, that's wild. Like I'm like literally dumbstruck by like this dangling thread of like, ooh, here you go. Here's a nice juicy worm on a hook waiting for you
And I
to
went,
bite. Absolutely swallows the hook, and then you go to the next slide and you just, yep, that's the biggest, most unfortunate, like obviously there's so much more context to it, but like in the frame of our specific project, just the worst. Just oh my god.
Yeah.
yeah.
Would
And
have
so
had all the answers, at least a lot of them.
a lot of them,
A
but
lot of
here's what's wild is that it is a whole roller coaster, not just one of those things where you go up and you just go down.
Yeah, that was
You're
the
welcome,
first big
guys.
drop. Okay,
That
but
was
it
the
is
first
going to keep
drop.
going.
It's gonna keep going. It's
Okay.
gonna keep going around. It's maybe an old rickety roller coaster, but
Yeah,
it's
that
gonna
was a
keep on
pretty
rolling.
big initial drop, though.
Ooh,
Oh, Nelly.
yeah. So the next slide I just want to have up just in case somebody wants to like take a screenshot and wants to like take this on. I currently cannot read Japanese, but this is the corresponding article in the Japanese section of the paper. And I've asked a few people to read it, and they're like, with the resolution and the archaic Japanese, and like they can't make it out. And they couldn't find. Well, we'll get to that
I can
later.
definitely see Northern California sumo, though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Ooh, look
that
at you.
the biggest text there.
Yeah.
Just from knowing, like trying to memorize some shikonas, like that top one is north.
Yeah.
And then the third and fourth one are sumo. But yep, okay. Well, I tried. That's as far as I got.
and so I you know, trying to use Google Translate. I don't know. I was having weird computer issues with like
Yeah.
seriously, my
I'm
computer
sorry, trying
crashes
to
when
translate
it starts.
katakana is also a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And
So
there's
it's
a
a mess.
lot of katakana in here.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, the hiragana and katakana, they have the little tiny like, you know, superscript so that you can read it for people who are, you know, can't read the kanji.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
so hiragana in particular, that usually will formulate a Japanese word, but katakana is used for any foreign word. Hey, JJ here from the echo chamber. So probably spending too much time on this, I know. But katakana is super, super important. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link down below. Definitely watch it. It'll kind of give you perspective. Katakana is really hard to figure out. You have to figure out what things sound phonetically. I know I said that in a couple seconds, but it's quite difficult. And then it'll help you understand why when you see katakana from old text, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, just link down there. It's a miscellaneous YouTube channel that I found that's pretty awesome. So give it a watch or don't and just be lost. That's up to you. So that could be English, it could be Dutch, it could be anything, and it's phonetically how it makes sense to the person writing. So it could mean absolutely nothing to you or me.
Yep.
I think I see tomato down
Well,
there.
and there is
But,
that's
like,
another
yeah.
weird thing about the formatting of these is that there's like two other articles like buried inside it too.
I
Like,
think that bottom left one might be food related.
yes. But which again goes to show like the wildness of these papers where there's like all this stuff about the war, and then there's like the Sumo Taikan. That's what they're going to call it. The Sumo Taikan, the Sumo Encyclopedia, and there's like other articles about agricultural issues, right? So yeah, that's the craziness. So kind of while we just have the slide sit here really quick. Now, like, what do I do with this as far as like trying to, because, okay, it happened December 7th. It probably didn't get published, but, right? Book publication.
But maybe there's something. Maybe there's
some, right?
Yeah.
So
a book doesn't come from nowhere, especially back then. So there has to be research, a rough draft, something out there.
Right. Galleys at a publisher, something, right? So that's where I start going into. Can I find these two guys? Can I find their publishers, right? So those are the angles I start trying to pursue, right? So focusing on the people for a second. So I just have a slide here that's boring kind of bullet points, but it's really like, how do you try to find a Nikkei person from, who was living on the West Coast in the 40s, like right before the outbreak of World War II? Like, how do you find them? And so there's a few things. These are more tips for like other researchers. So yeah. So first is the newspapers that I was looking at. So like I found that article in the Hoji Shimbun collection. In the Shinsekai, the New World daily news, the Shinsekai Asahi Shimbun. So it's in the Hoji Shimbun collection at Stanford, at the Hoover Institution. And so I start looking for other references to these guys. So we'll go through some of those that I find and the interesting stories I find there. The other is the 1940 census, right? So that happened only a year and a half before the start of the war, so there might be not that much movement, right?
Sure.
So that, and then the 1950 census might tell you where that person went after the war. Did they go back to California? Did they go somewhere else, right? And all over the West Coast. We talked about the removal and incarceration and everything in another episode, and we'll talk about it a little bit more.
I'm sure there's plenty of names on the 1941 that aren't on the 1951.
Yeah, or they're moved somewhere else. Yeah. So, those are some places. Now, there's a couple other ones. One is the WRA final disposition. So this is the WRA is the War Relocation Authority. So it's the thing that at the end of the internment concentration camps, the War Relocation Authority has this massive document that's in the National Archives that says like, what happened to people? When did they report to an assembly center? What camps did they go to? How did they move around? Like, were they paroled and moved to, the Twin Cities or Chicago, or, go out to university or something like that, right? Or did they join the military? Like, all these sorts of details are in there, including, and this is, kind of heartbreaking, children born in camps, right? There'll be, a mother and father and then 3 kids, and then there'll be a 4th kid that doesn't have an address from before the war because they were born in the camp, right?
But if they're born there, they're a citizen, so they're still getting tracked and registered for stuff.
Right. So, you can find people who were born and where they were born in these camps, right? Yeah. So that's one thing that you can use to find people. The other is alien enemy catalogs. So these were created for all Issei. So Issei, because they're aliens and we're at war with Japan, they're alien enemies. So they were all even more carefully tracked. So there are records, there's often FBI reports, and there's catalogs of that stuff in the National Archives and Records Administration. So that. The other is archival photos. So sometimes there's archival photos in places like Calisphere, Densho Digital Repository, the Japanese American National Museum, and other institutions all over the country. And National Archives has some too. That some have names. Some don't, but you might be able to extrapolate from them, which is also an interesting puzzle. And the other thing is just getting lucky on the internet, which sounds really bad, but sometimes you just get lucky.
I imagine, like, if I was doing this and I had a name that I hadn't heard before, Google it. That's step one. See if the answer is easy, right?
Yep.
So, like, yeah, I mean, obviously that's not going to bring up the deepest and darkest stuff from all these newspapers and whatnot. But like, if that guy, like that ISO, I can't remember. I'm sorry. What was that guy's first name? Like, if I didn't,
the governor of Hawaii. Yeah.
Like, I hadn't heard that name. So my first step would be Googling and be like, oh, wow, this guy's way more important than I realized.
Yeah.
He has a Wikipedia page, that's striking gold for sure.
Right.
But I imagine that's not the case for most of the names that you come across.
Well, and I think another thing that's just kind of interesting about this whole process, and I think we'll probably talk about it in our kind of wrap-up episode, but it's worth kind of talking about here, is that you also find out when you're doing this kind of research, the kind of vagaries and flaws with internet search algorithms. You find out that, like we talked about, I think, a little bit more with like Grand Sumo and searching Grand Sumo. It's almost impossible to find amateur sumo in Japan just because all the algorithms reward and all the content is about Grand Sumo. Like, we know amateur sumo is happening in Japan. We know it
more than anywhere else.
Right. But finding stuff on the internet about it,
sure,
it's hard, especially in English. Right. And even in a prior episode about Bud Mukaye, we talk about the Battle of Leyte. It's even silly stuff like the Battle of Leyte. Trying to find something about the land battle on the island of Leyte is hard.
Okay, sure.
Military history nerds are obsessed with the naval battle of Leyte, and there's like tons of articles and books and like all kinds of obsession about the naval battle of Leyte. But the land battle, there's some stuff on a Wikipedia page, but there's not much. And so it's one of those things that, like, as you kind of do history research yourself, you do sometimes find that like people do kind of all obsess about similar things, or like the algorithms will reward one kind of world of information, but there's other stuff hiding behind that. Right.
Sure.
And so to me, that's one of the values of this, realizing like, just because it's the stuff that pops up first doesn't mean it's what you're really trying to find. Right. So anyway, but sometimes you get lucky. So the first thing is, I'm like, okay, that Gyoji guy, I've seen references to a Gyoji, right? So that Teisuke Takahashi, name of a Gyoji. So I start looking and I'm like, is this the guy? We've shown this picture a bunch of times because it's one of the easiest, like, popular pictures that shows up. It's from the Japanese American National Museum. One of the first pictures I saw when I searched sumo, just Googling it. There's this Gyoji there, right? And Mitsuga Hamanaka, who I know by this point is the California Yokozuna, is the guy in the middle, and right just to his left is a Gyoji. Okay. Is this the guy? Right. And so I try to find out a little bit more about Teisuke Takahashi. Because there's no label, no name for this Gyoji in the picture. So I start looking up about Gyoji, I start looking up stuff about Teisuke Takahashi. And so I've talked about it a little bit before, but what I find is that in early 1936, so just kind of telling the story a little bit more, in early 1936, this guy from Sacramento, Teisuke Takahashi, went to Japan and got certified by the Tate Gyoji, who always has the name, Kimura Shonosuke, and came back to America and became a Gyoji and continued to be a Gyoji. And another cool detail I found from an article in mid-February of 1936 was that basically, apparently, this guy's whole family and kind of club like chipped in all this money to send him over to Japan to do that. So it was kind of this, one for all, all for one for all sort of thing in this article. And it's from the Kashu Mainichi, which is a Southern California paper. So I don't know if it's this guy, but it seems fairly likely because this picture is from Fresno in 1938, right? And Mitsuga Hamanaka is the Northern California Yokozuna. So this seems likely.
Yeah, sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but do we have other pictures that we know are the right guy that we can compare?
That we know? No.
Ah, okay.
And that's okay to ask, and I'm willing to answer it. I was like, yeah, I'll answer it. That we know for sure, no. But I think we can, I don't know, quadrangulate.
Yeah. If there are other facts that can help us verify certain things, and there are pictures of those things or whatnot. Yeah. Okay. I'll be patient.
No, it's fine. It's a reasonable question because these are all the things of like, where do I have other pictures? Is this the same guy? Do I have anything with a name? Like, that's exactly what I'm doing. And like, because I'm also looking at all my notes I've already, made from stuff. Right. So, I also start looking up this guy's name and what do I know about him, right? So what I do find is in the 1940 census, Teisuke Takahashi is living in Sacramento with his stepson, Tom Ogino, and Tom's kids. And then his son, Tony Takahashi, also lives there. And it also lists his profession as, I think I made a passing reference to this, maybe not connected to him, he was a cannery worker. That was his profession.
Sure.
There's also a thing called, that was the history of the Japanese in America that was published in 1940. And it lists all the officers of the Northern California Sumo Association. And in that, it does list Kimura Teisuke as the Gyoji of the Northern California Sumo Association. So that like connects like, all right, Sacramento, this guy, this name. I'm not seeing other Teisuke Takahashis. But later we'll get to a few things about why sometimes he didn't show up until I dug deeper because spelling.
Ah, sure.
And even now with all kinds of digitized records, if you're looking at handwritten records, which a lot of census stuff is handwritten by a census worker, an I and an E, a I and a T, a E and an A, like a lot of these letters get H's and N's, all kinds of stuff, right?
And I imagine there's also, maybe this is just something I'm ignorant on, but like westernizing the spelling for somebody whose name was Japanese and they've only ever written it in kanji.
That you would think I would see more issues with that, but that's actually a little rarer. More what I'm seeing is the name is spelled correctly, or at least the ones I've found. But like the scanning, the digitized scanning is just mixing letters up. So if anybody's
so something that could happen with any handwritten stuff, as opposed to anything specific to it being Japanese people, or I guess like non-English speaking or non-traditionally English names or what have you.
Yeah. Well, and also even just, newspapers, when I'm looking at newspapers, a lot of times, like I'm looking for the word sumo, but the word sometimes same will scan.
Oh, okay.
right? Just because you're looking at fuzzy edges of letters, it's a 4-letter word, and the A and the E on same end up looking like sumo, right? Whereas the S and M are more distinctive letters. So especially with vowels, like you'll see a lot of odd vowel shifts, and then like N's and H's and things like that, where it's just like a little length difference. So that kind of stuff you have to work through when you do this kind of research. And it's the same with genealogy research, all that sort of stuff. You have to like dig through weird spelling variations to help like break through some of those things. So I'm not 100% sure, but I have a hunch. Like at this point, I'm like 30% sure that this is Teisuke Takahashi, maybe a little bit more, right? So then I start looking a little into the other guy who's mentioned, Shigeru Nagata. So him, I search by name. I Google his name. I look in the Hoji Shimbun collection for his name. And the problem is, and then I also look in like, we don't have a sponsorship, so I won't say the name, but, genealogy search websites, and use them as resources. And what's confusing is there's two guys who live in, well, I don't know at first. I don't know at first. So I'm seeing an article and I'm like taking notes down because I find this guy Shigeru Nagata, and he's marrying this lady whose family ran the tea garden in San Francisco. And he was a USC graduate, and his family ran a florist shop in the Bay Area. And his name's Shigeru Nagata. And he's born around the right time, lives in San Francisco around the right time I'm looking at. His shows up in papers in the 30s in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And then, it gives birth dates and place of birth and then death dates. And what's frustrating is that person also gets mixed up with another Shigeru Nagata, who is the journalist who's mentioned in the article. But it's how do you like parse out which person is which? Because some people who've done some research and connected dots, I think, have connected the wrong dots.
Gotcha. And
so you got to kind of work past that too. So there's this other Shigeru Nagata who also married a woman who was Nisei. An Issei guy marrying an Issei. And he's a journalist at some papers in the San Francisco area. He switches from paper to paper a couple times. He tries to start his own paper. So he's named Shigeru Nagata. And one of the interesting tidbits is he's married to a lady named Mary Tanaka. And she is descended from people who are on the Kanrin Maru. Do you guys know what the Kanrin Maru was?
I do not.
Ooh.
Tangent. I like it.
Oh, this is totally a tangent, but also why it's kind of awesome to do history. So, there's this book I read called How They Saw Us, I think, and it's about the 1860 Grand Embassy. And so if you could go to the next slide.
Yes.
We've talked a little bit before about how there's those like times and places where like all the important people happen to be like all eating at the same cafe and stuff.
Sure.
And this voyage was one of those.
This was I think last time we talked about that, we referenced the Argo in Greek mythology.
Yeah,
this was literally a ship. So, hey,
it is literally a ship
there. Yeah, so 1860, this is before the other traditional first contact type of story is happening, right? Like when did
So this is after Commodore Perry goes to Japan with his black ships. And forces Japan to trade openly with the world and allow there to be like open ports and church freedom of religion in Japan. There's this whole treaty that's imposed on Japan. It's even in Japan, it's even called the unequal treaties. And it leads to, so it's at the end of the Edo period, the rule of the Tokugawa Bakufu for 250 years, where Japan was unified and fairly peaceful, but ruled by the Tokugawa bureaucracy for 250 years. So in 1853, American naval ships show up in Tokyo Harbor and basically fire some warning shots off and say like, hey, you guys are a little behind the time. We could burn your city down with a few shots. So just so you know. So why don't we trade? And then they actually come back like, hey, think about it. We'll come back. And so they come back, and Japan, it forces a huge crisis in Japan. So that's, believe it or not, the short version. But eventually these treaties are ratified in Japan by the Bakufu, and an embassy gets sent from Japan to the US. And it serves like multiple purposes. Ratify the treaty, an embassy, establish diplomatic contact, like where you're sending Japanese people. And also the nascent Japanese Navy, where they bought a Dutch ship, the Kanrin Maru, had it built, and they're having basically a training crew on this ship, and they're going to do their trans-Pacific steamer voyage on this steam-powered naval ship in 1860. And so they go to Hawaii and then San Francisco, and then they go around to, this is before there's the transcontinental railroad, so they go down to Panama, and then before the Panama Canal, they go across the Isthmus of Panama, and then they go up to Washington, D.C.
I guess I didn't realize people did Panama even when they couldn't take their boat with them.
Yeah, and many people got sick going through Panama.
It is jungle, and that yeah.
So this voyage, they stop off in San Francisco, and some descendants of people of this voyage later moved to San Francisco during the Meiji period. And so that's who Mary Tanaka is descended from, is one of the guys on this voyage. Wow. But it's just a fascinating voyage. So I just want to talk about like 3 people who were on this, just because it is just a complete tangent, but it's such an interesting window into what would the late Tokugawa through Meiji period Japan. So the first is the guy who's on the 10,000 yen bill. So this guy's named Fukuzawa Yukichi. He's on the very bottom right. Anybody who's gotten, when I went to Sanpoku Sumo Supply in Tokyo to buy a bunch of mawashi for the club, I had a stack of these. So a stack of Yukichis. I'm trying to popularize that. It's like a stack of Benjamins, but in Japan.
And it is roughly equivalent to $100.
Roughly, yeah. So a stack of Yukichis, I go in and I buy some mawashi. But he's the guy like on these bills. And what he went on this voyage as like a lower level samurai, but later he becomes an educator, a reformer, a public health expert, and a feminist, like in the Meiji period. Like he's this young samurai at the time of this voyage, but he kind of gets this intrigue and all these foreign ideas, and he adopts them, and he becomes this reformer in Meiji period Japan. Because 9 years after this is the Meiji Restoration, where imperial power, rather than the Tokugawa, which is like a feudal system, was replaced by a kind of centralized imperial system. So he's, this influential figure during this period. He's the Benjamin Franklin of the Meiji period, right? The other is the guy who's at the center top picture. His name is Katsukaishu. Have you guys ever heard of Katsukaishu?
No.
So this guy's really interesting. So I read a book about him a while ago. His dad was like a low-class samurai during the Tokugawa period, and a drunk and a gambler who wasted all their family's money. But he wrote a diary about it. So his dad wrote this popular diary about being a dissolute, like a down on his luck samurai. Katsukaishu basically becomes a bureaucrat within the Tokugawa Bakufu in the 1850s, like a low-level bureaucrat. But he holds this really interesting place within that transitional politics, where he is a Tokugawa loyalist, fights on the Tokugawa side, the new pro-imperialist young radicals who start emerging after these unequal treaties, who want to restore imperial power. One of them, this guy who's also super famous, Sakamoto Ryoma in Japan, goes to assassinate Katsukaishu. goes into his house and is going to assassinate Katsukaishu. This is like in the early 1860s, I think.
Yeah.
And Katsukaishu basically talks to him and says, like, what are you doing here, kid? Like, what are you wanting? Like, this great Japan? Like how are you going to get there? Like, what's your plan after you kill me? And he basically talks to this guy and convinces him to become his, like, protege.
Huh.
But this is the bizarre thing about, like, Katsukaishu and, like, the position he sits in this era is that he remains a total Bakufu loyalist, fights on the Bakufu side during the coming civil war. But he's literally friends with the most radical fringe of pro-imperialist, like, folks, and openly, like, and he's like an intermediary between them, where he just speaks candidly and openly to both sides, where he's just like, hey, I just want a good Japan. Like, I'm going to serve my current lord. That's my loyalty. I get what you're trying to do, but I think you're misguided, but we'll just be straight up about it. And then when the Meiji Restoration happens and the imperialists, like, win, he remains an official. Like, he becomes an official in the Meiji government for decades. And as a trusted advisor, like the guy who can speak truth to everybody.
Huh.
Sounds like a less damaging to the world version of Henry Kissinger, who's just kind of there regardless of who's in power. He's the bureaucrat that they use.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a similar thing.
I don't know. I think it's rude to compare anyone to Henry Kissinger, but you get my point. People on opposite sides of the spectrum would still go to the same guy for stuff, and he
still knows what he still knows what he's talking about, knows all the people, and they know they can count on him to just give his unvarnished, candid opinion, right? Like,
and that appeals to people that are otherwise on complete opposite sides of things,
right? And who they might hear yes people just telling them what they want to hear, right? And so sometimes you want the person who will say to you, like, hey, nah, that's not gonna work.
No, that's stupid.
Hard truth.
Yeah, you can trust that I'm telling you the truth, even though you won't like it.
Yeah. And so, he's a really, he's just such a super interesting figure. And he's on this voyage too, right? So the other figure is the guy who's at the bottom, very bottom. And there's lots of little, like, YouTube videos about this guy, because this guy led such an interesting life, called John Manjiro. So John Manjiro was born in Japan in, like, I think, like 1830 or so. And he and his brothers went on a fishing trip out from where they lived in Shikoku. And they got stranded on an island off the coast of Japan, like, as almost the only survivors. A New England whaling ship picks them up. And this is while Japan is closed to the world for like 250 years. Well, it's not completely closed to the world. It's mostly closed. Like, there's some Chinese and Dutch traders who can kind of trade in certain places, but mostly closed. And so they're picked up by these New England whalers. He goes to live in Massachusetts in the 1840s, gets taught English, joins the crew of whaling ships, sails all over the world, becomes an officer on a whaling ship. So then he's getting a big cut of the proceeds. By about, like, I think as 1850, he's made enough money that when he is in Hawaii, he has enough money to buy a ship. And then he basically gets himself, and I forget if there were any other of survivors of his crew or his brothers, dumped off again in off the coast of Japan again, and he, like, basically rows ashore, and he's like, I'm home, and he immediately, like, is imprisoned and interrogated because he's broken the law. But he speaks fluent English.
You can't not bring that guy.
And so, and this is 1860, so he's been back in Japan. He's one of the chief interpreters on the Japanese side when Commodore Perry shows up in Tokyo Harbor.
Got it.
Wow.
Okay.
All right.
So this guy, like John Manjiro, is also one of those people who just, like, all over the world, lives a super interesting life. And people think he's probably, like, the first Japanese person to have ridden a train, a steamship, officered an American vessel, like a whaling vessel, and then to command a trans-Pacific voyage. Like that guy.
That is, yeah. That's a movie right there. That's just the Odyssey. Him getting home after like, oh yeah, my boat sank a couple miles that way, so I went to the other side of the planet to get back here.
Yeah.
I also know English, and there's an entire world out there that I'm going to expose the rest of you to.
Yeah. So
By the
he's just it's wild. Like
Fascinating.
the people who are like on this trip. So yeah. Anyway, but again, this is the, you just follow where the story goes, and
Yeah.
you find a pressing reference, and you're like, oh yeah, I read a book about that, and then I did a deep dive, and I'm like, oh yeah, right.
So I guess what we're getting at though is you saw that this this person that our current subject got married to is a descendant of people that went descendant of people from this extremely famous all-star game of history.
Yeah,
of the
and so
voyage.
right, so in the San Francisco papers, when there's like descendants of, or delegations from Japan that come over, they're like, oh hey, at the local Japanese society, there's this lecture, and by the way, we've got a bunch of locals, including Mrs. Shigeru Nagata, who is descended from one of the other interpreters on the Kanrin Maru Grand Embassy. So yeah, that's the like this weird aside. But I still don't at this point know which Shigeru Nagata really I'm looking at. It's probably the journalist, but I'm seeing all these like conflicting details that people have like connected, and I want to make sure it wasn't some guy who like was a journalist on the side, but a florist, but there's like two different people they're apparently married to. So anyway, and both Shigeru Nagata are married to kind of old Nikkei families in San Francisco, right? Who are well established too. So that's the other interesting thing about both Shigeru Nagata.
The journalist seems like the gimme, but like at the same time, like my day job is engineering. Like if somebody were to like, if I was notable for, some other thing, Sumo would probably not even come up. And then somebody in the future would be like, was it the Jake Boyer who did engineering, or the Jake Boyer who was in like something more relevant to amateur sumo? Like, I don't know, event management or whatever. But like, yeah, that you might guess wrong. So yeah, that's worth pulling both those threads.
Yeah. And so one other thread that kind of mentioned is like, what if like publisher galleys, like something like that. So I tried to find a little bit more about like publishers and publishers that published the previous edition, like that Japanese encyclopedia that Shigeru Nagata contributed to. But I wasn't that it didn't go anywhere, but I did find a cool thing that's worth sharing. So JJ, if you could click share this San Francisco Japantown map. So this is just a cool thing that if people are interested in Nikkei history, there's this thing called the Japantown Atlas, where you can look at a granular level maps of Japantowns up and down the West Coast that were mapped by this guy as a project that show the Japanese businesses in Japantowns up and down the West Coast. I think my favorite one in this one is just off like Sutter Street in Japantown in San Francisco is the Nippon Goldfish Company. But there's restaurants, boarding houses, theaters, bookstores, florists. Like this is like a window into this whole vibrant community.
Very cool.
Yeah, so I just wanted to like share it because I was trying to find a publisher and I ran across this. I was like, oh, that's cool. And there is one for Little Tokyo in LA that will show a little bit more in the next episode.
So you might not have found the business you were looking for, but you found all the other businesses.
Yeah. So
Cool.
So I just wanted to share it really quick as like a cool thing. If anybody's like curious about this and is a map nerd, like I am, I'm a super map nerd. I love maps. Anyway. So yeah, just wanted to share that as a cool thing that didn't lead anywhere, but it's a cool thing, right?
Yeah.
So the other thing is
still.
Yeah. So the other thing is then I started looking at, I finally found something that helped me kind of narrow down Shigeru Nagata, right? So that's Shigeru Nagata's Japanese internee card or alien enemy card. So if you could zoom in, you can actually zoom in. It's 4 pages long. I think his, like, the third page is blank.
Little plus sign over there on the left. There
Sorry.
No, it's okay. This is the joy of me making it a surprise episode, is that there's things like this. It's my fault. So a couple things that are interesting about this one is that on the first page, it does talk about, like, and this is like a card from the National Archives, right? Like a little info card. It says that he was living with his address in San Francisco. And then from that, I was able to backtrack and find the reason I couldn't find him in the 1940 census is his name was, like, completely mangled. So, like, this is one of those, like, oh, okay, that's why I wasn't able to find him. But once I got an address, I was able to look another way, and I was able to find him. So just, I don't know about pro tip, but amateur tip.
In case any of you are trying to locate individuals around the time of World War II in Southern California. Yeah. May not apply to everybody, but still good to know, fun to learn your process.
So there's a couple other things that are interesting in here. One is that there's a warrant issued for him in March of 1942. So that's before the mass removals. So there was a warrant issued on March 20th of 1942, and he was apprehended the following day and put in FBI custody. So this is before the mass removals, but after Executive Order 9066. So that's interesting that he was arrested in that in-between period, right? So the other things that are in here is the FBI says that they found contraband when they searched his property, but no specifics. And what counted as contraband, I don't know. He may have just had a radio so he could listen to sumo in Japan. Like, there were people who, like, that's why they got big fancy radios, is so they could listen to trans-Pacific sumo coverage on the radio. That's stuff I ran across from oral history stuff here in San Diego. So there's a couple other interesting tidbits here. And I think one, like, that I wanted to, well, there's a couple that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on. There's a little note in here from December of 1942 saying he does not wish to be united with his family in a family internment center.
Whoa.
Right?
Really?
So we're going to later play an interview with Brian Nia, or we might have already posted it by the time this goes live, who's kind of an expert on he is an expert on internment and things like that. And he kind of gave a window into the kind of decision making that might be happening here. And I don't remember if he talked specifically about this, but after he talked about it a little bit, I was like, oh, that makes sense. So think about what I told you about his wife.
The descendant of this famous group.
But she's been in San Francisco a while, right? She is a U.S. citizen already.
Oh, okay.
And so are her kids.
Mm-hmm. But our subject himself is not.
Right.
Okay.
So what happened during World War II is if there was a family and they were all going to an alien enemy camp together, they would stay in that alien enemy camp. So that was in Crystal City, Texas, the family camp. But because they were U.S. citizens, they were eligible earlier to parole, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is, I don't know. It's weird. Like, I was thinking about it. I mean, this is like an expression of love. Like, they're going to be separate, but he's going to give his family the option of leaving the camp.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what they do. Like, his wife and his 2 sons leave the camp. And the other thing is I start connecting names here that confirm that the journalist and this Shigeru Nagata, because the kids' names, it's actually the kids' names and the census that help me lock in that we're looking at the right person.
Sure.
And so there's letters from his wife and his son saying, hey, can he come out? And the final kind of decider is that his eldest son was getting inducted into the army and was going to go overseas. And so because of that, the teenage son was going to be running amok in Chicago with the mom. And so they're like, hey, we have a minor son. Can we get a father figure back over here to like help keep an eye on him? And that's basically the appeal. So there's these like summaries of these letters and petitions from family saying like, hey, can he get released so that he can help support the family? And so in the spring of 1944, actually August of 1944, he actually paroles to 4859 North Winthrop Avenue in Chicago in August of 1944. Yeah. So it gets crazy detailed. And then Alien Enemy proceedings are suspended for him after the war ends. So he moves to Chicago after the war. Yeah. So like these little cards, even though they're just like cards that just have little typewritten notes, can be like a treasure trove of helping confirm who a person is and, you know, kind of like give a window into the decisions people were having to make.
Yeah. Certainly explains why he might not have connected with his friend in San Francisco to finish that book that they were planning.
Yeah. So that does get interesting though. So it does get interesting because I'm like, wait, a bunch of Issei leaders were getting interned in a specific camp. Most Issei leaders, not all, but most ended up going to the Santa Fe INS camp that was run by the Department of Justice at that time. That's how the organization worked, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I was like, oh, have I seen pictures from Santa Fe? I think I saw a sumo picture from Santa Fe.
Yeah, okay. With a very centrally located, well-dressed Gyoji in it.
Yeah. And does that guy look a little bit like that Gyoji from 1938?
There you go.
Maybe if like this would be, I think about 6 years later. About 6 years later. But that sure looks like him.
Sure could be, yeah.
Sure could be.
Yeah, look at that photo. That's crazy. I mean, look at how many people are out there doing sumo. It's almost like all of the nationals photos that we've been posting recently.
All of our nationals photos have tons of like volunteers and stuff in there too. But like if you were to do just the competitors, it'd probably be about this many people at, post 2020 nationals here.
Yeah.
That's a great turnout.
This is 1944.
Yeah. This is 1944 at the Santa Fe DOJ camp. So, I mean, if you want me to talk about it on air, I can actually, yeah, I do want to talk about it on air. So I'll save that for when it's back on air.
Okay.
But yeah, there's some other interesting subtext to this.
We're still, you can just continue to talk. We're good.
Okay. All right. Okay. So one other thing with this photo that's kind of interesting and notable, and this is just kind of, I don't know about supposition, but it's kind of inside Japanese nationalist politics, is that you'll notice there are a lot of younger men here too. And if you'll notice from a lot of the pictures we saw from the 1930s of Nisei wrestlers, like the hair, pay attention to the hair. I saw this picture and kind of knowing what I know about kind of Japan and kind of politics of that era, a lot of these young men with the shaved heads, marubozu, that's kind of a sign of them saying they're pro-imperialist, they're ultra-nationalists.
Ah, okay.
Or they've adopted kind of pro-nationalist, kind of like ultra-Japanese nationalist sentiments, right?
Sure.
Which can be like a little challenging, right? Like this is not an angle of kind of Japanese American history I've thought or looked about very much. Like I know about the tension internally.
But yeah, there's definitely a range of opinions among any group that you have, and
yeah,
that's probably the people that the army leadership were looking at when they're like, well, we got to put everybody in camps. These younger kids are sympathizing with who is now our enemy, like they might. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is like right now, like I think the takeaway is we don't know, right?
Mhm.
We really don't know. But right away I was like, ooh, that's a pretty nationalist looking picture. As far as like the shaved heads were a thing of a lot of the ultra nationalist young men at the time. But the other thing is that a lot of these men might not have entered the camps ultra nationalist, right?
Oh, yeah.
But they're all put in camps, right, together.
Mhm.
Some of them U.S. citizens, or even if they weren't, maybe their younger siblings were. And they're all put in camps together. And then in early 1943, they're all forced to do these loyalty questionnaires to say, are you loyal to America? And we talk quite a bit about it in some of our other interviews, these loyalty questionnaires. But you're forcing people to make a choice about something that a lot of them thought they shouldn't have to make a choice about.
Sure.
And so I think that's one of the things that we've learned over the last few decades about kind of radicalization too, is that sometimes the people who radicalize aren't people who were inclined to radicalize. They wanted to belong. They wanted to be included and be part of a society, but that society rejected them.
Yeah.
And then they go
choose them up and
and they go hard the other direction. Right. And so, having a little bit of that's kind of how that radicalization process can play out. Right.
And only one government is forcing them into a prison camp.
Right.
So I can sympathize a lot with people having negative thoughts on that particular government. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we will have a future story that tells the experience in Japan too. We will go there too in a future episode. Because the Japanese government wasn't, fantastic at the time. But for these young men, right, who was the one controlling them, controlling their family, putting them in camps, making them choose, right?
Like I said, I can sympathize with hating the person that is hurting you right now.
Yeah.
Regardless of the greater situation. If somebody is hurting you right now, I don't think it's wrong to be upset with them.
Yeah.
Or consider other things that you might not have otherwise. Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge, complicated world. And if somebody is putting you in a camp, I think it's okay to be mad at them.
Yeah. So going back to the sumo, because we talked about like, this is like a big crowd, right?
Yeah.
Is also the gyoji, right? We're looking for the gyoji. So later, after I've seen this picture, I get a dump of pictures that the archivist at the Japanese American National Museum makes public. They're viewable on Japanese American National Museum on their e-museum. So these are viewable pictures for anybody. And we showed it in a previous one of the Nishida brothers, the 6 brothers.
Yeah.
Note the gyoji.
And in this picture, is he named as Kimura Teisuke?
No, but these are Sacramento. This is a Sacramento family in the mid to late 1930s with a gyoji.
Oh,
and that sure looks like the same guy to me.
Heavy circumstantial evidence, but I was just curious if it was explicit.
Yeah. So this is again like taking me to well, okay. This is sure looking like okay, but was this guy Teisuke Takahashi at Santa Fe, right? So there I look in National Archives and Records Administration and look at the Alien Enemy catalog card, and I pull that up and I find it for him. And now let's look at that.
Okay, details are lining up so far.
Yeah. So he's about 60 when he went into the camp. It says that a warrant was issued for him on February 15th of 1942, and he was arrested in Sacramento on February 16th of 1942. Okay. One thing that's really interesting about this to me is this is actually several days before Executive Order 9066.
Yeah, that's even earlier than our other guy.
Yes. So a solid month before, and it's before the executive order. So it's an FBI roundup, and I find more later, which is really interesting.
Do you think it's because he's seen as a community leader, as
Yeah.
a 61-year-old man, Issei, that went to Japan, learned something, and then came back?
He learned ancient secret Japanese arts. Never
Yeah.
mind that it's related to youth sports, but still.
Yeah. So, right. So that's my takeaway from this too. He's interned at that point. There's little details about, some, I forget it's here or elsewhere, like contraband found. So there's things about his, his desire to actually basically be able to be rehoused to like basically hang out with a friend in July of 1944. But one of the things that's interesting is that he is, according to these records, requesting repatriation to Japan. So he's requesting repatriation to Japan. But at one point, he does request paroling out to the community, and basically the person who's kind of his case manager, classification person, says, okay, let's review this. And basically the response is like, hey, review these FBI reports. I haven't seen those FBI reports, to be transparent. I haven't found them yet. They might exist somewhere, but after those are reviewed, he does not parole. He is not released. And there's a parenthetical note that says, and I'm quoting the note in here, that says, believed definitely pro-Jap. And so he's not released.
That repatriation request alone would be something that I imagine people would take a second look at.
Yeah. And so in November of 1945, he does repatriate to Japan aboard the SS General Randall, which is a troop ship. It's, I think, the first or second voyage of the SS Randall that goes back and forth, carrying people back and forth. And if you look at like the Wikipedia entry on it, they're like, oh, it was like diplomats. I was like, no, it was a lot of like Issei who were repatriating to Japan on that voyage. And then American soldiers who were getting discharged from the military were getting sent back to America.
I gotcha.
And so, he gets repatriated to Japan. And here's one of the infuriating things, trying to find this guy, looking at like death records and genealogy stuff, is that there's a person with a similar name who dies in LA in like about 1980. And people think that's the same guy, but
that's too old.
But well, we'll get to another story later where somebody lives that long.
But I guess that would put him at 100. So yeah, never mind.
Yeah,
it's not outrageously okay.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a stretch. Unlikely, it's a stretch. But I was able to like do a bit more digging and find out that was a different Teisuke Takahashi.
Gotcha.
This Teisuke Takahashi disappears. But there's a couple just super intriguing tidbits on this one. There's two notes from November of 1946. The first one says, there's an inventory of the property of the subject who has departed from the U.S., who has repatriated to Japan. This property is in the possession of the San Francisco field office of the FBI. Your advice is requested as to the location of the property warehouse to which this property should be forwarded. And then there's a list attached. But I can't find that list. This is just a catalog of an entry. So his stuff that might include that sumo Taikan might be in that property.
It's in a crate being Indiana Jonesed into a giant warehouse somewhere.
And that is exactly the image I had in my head.
Yeah.
Literally, that is the exact image I have in my head. Is like, oh God, 1946. This stuff is just sent off to some Indiana Jones warehouse somewhere.
Yeah.
And
some FBI field office that has like, a warehouse attached with 1 million boxes. There's this sumo book next to the Ark of the Covenant, next to, all of the gold from Fort Knox or whatever. Yeah, it could be. That's frustrating that we don't even have like I mean, something from this long ago, I can't imagine it's all that classified. It's probably just deemed unimportant and therefore not findable very easily.
Yeah.
Forgotten, collecting dust.
Yeah.
Or just destroyed at some point where they're like, this is
eventually,
ancient
why-
stuff, right? We'll
yeah.
keep the card catalog that the thing happened, but you can't keep that volume of federal records.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So then there's a follow-up memo just saying that, you know, the request is forwarded as to the final disposition of his property, and, you know, see this report. And so there's a catalog number, which I'm totally going to chase that down. I am totally going to chase that down still. I'm not done. I'm not done with this story. Now, we're close to done with our part of the story for this episode. But the other thing to kind of think about is like what Japan he was returning to in late 1945, right? And I would highly recommend 2 movies to get a real window. And I'm dead serious about this as a double feature. It's not some Barbenheimer Oppen Barbie thing. Like as a genuine window.
No, these are both very relevant to this time period.
Yeah. And have both you guys seen Grave of the Fireflies?
I've seen both of these, and you are not kidding with that caption there.
It's my favorite movie of all time.
Really?
Grave of the Fireflies?
Yeah, my favorite anime of all time, because it does something that I didn't know anime could do, and it's just so dark and real and told a story that I didn't understand the people, and as you grow, you kind of understand the people more.
Yeah. It is, I don't know, maybe The Killing Fields like equals it. But yeah, it is like the bleakest movie ever. But also,
go ahead, sorry.
No,
I was just gonna say it's that one along with I'm sorry, I movie nerd very hard every single episode, but Satoshi Kon, that director, does stuff with anime that only works in anime. Like it can't work in live action or any other medium. Grave of the Fireflies is similar. It would just be like exploitative to do it as a live action story, but as an animation, it I wouldn't say detaches you a little bit, but it makes it feel less. Yeah, there you go. You can swallow the pill to get the right message through without being just over the top for the sake of it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's, if you've ever seen the TV show BoJack Horseman, it's kind of the same way. It like uses animation to kind of soften the incredibly heavy blows it's landing on you constantly. And yeah, it is a JJ. If it's your favorite movie of all time, that sounds like you probably watched it more than once. Once was all I could do.
I watch it multiple times a year, and it's one of those that I introduce to people because I think that we don't understand what happened over there, and it shows what people had to deal with. And it's just such a wild human experience. But it's you know, it is a story that could have happened from there. You know what I mean?
It did happen thousands and thousands of times.
Yep.
To some level or other. Yeah. Have you guys seen the altered version of this poster?
Which one, of Grave of the Fireflies?
Grave of the Fireflies. There, actually, it might be a different one. There's a Grave of the Fireflies poster that looks similar to this, or at least the sky looks similar to this. And if you ratchet the brightness way up, you can see that they're not all fireflies.
Oh.
Yeah, if you turn up the brightness, you can see the silhouette of a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that some of those fireflies have parachutes on them, meaning they are incendiary explosives, not fireflies. The insect.
So Grave of the Fireflies, I highly recommend it to everybody. I also would totally understand, and if anybody watches the movie and goes, once is enough, I can never watch it again. But it is one of the best movies I've ever seen. It is beautiful and bleak. And I am also dead serious about, I was on a bus ride to Manzanar for the Manzanar pilgrimage last year when an English professor sitting next to me said, like, have you watched Godzilla -1? It's actually fantastic. And I was like, what? And I watched it. I'm like, she is absolutely correct. Godzilla -1 is, I think, a good palate cleanser for Grave of the Fireflies, but I think also Grave of the Fireflies lays a foundation for just what they were fighting for, like in Godzilla -1, like in the sense of like the devastation and then the re-devastation and how are we going to rebuild, right?
Well, also being like a satisfying, cool movie.
Yeah. So I really genuinely recommend both.
Oh yeah, there you go. That's the picture I was thinking of.
I haven't seen that. That's really cool. Yeah. So can't recommend Grave of the Fireflies highly enough, and I would also recommend Godzilla -1. It is substantive.
If you need something in the middle of that, just add in Barefoot Gan. It kind of is a little nicer. It's not as aggressive.
Okay.
But it's still within the same situation. And if you watch what's happening and people fighting for food, it'll give you a sense of things that were happening.
Yeah.
And it's an animated film.
So there's one other tidbit that was in those cards, and it mentions that Teisuke Takahashi's son was stationed overseas. And another thing that's really interesting about that is that his son was stationed overseas during the US occupation outside of Tokyo. So in some ways, he was reunifying with his son, Tony, in Japan, who was stationed in Japan. And there's marriage records of his son getting married in Japan during the US occupation in the late 40s. Cool. I've tried to kind of connect with the Takahashi family, but I haven't been successful. But yeah, that was really kind of interesting. So that's just another like thing about, another calculus might be for him is, my son's over there already. Yeah. Otherwise he had stepkids. But the other thing is, he'd built a whole life in America. He'd been there, but then his whole community was scattered, and, why stay in America at that point? But the Japan he was going back to was devastated.
Yeah.
Devastated. Yeah. So, and then the next thing I want to show, this is just another like why do history, but also very challenging. So there's this guy who, so JJ, you'll want to scroll all the way down to the bottom. It's like the second from the last cable. So this is a trove of documents that this guy posted to the internet of FBI cables between December of 1941 and into the late winter of 1942. And he has a whole bunch of other declassified FBI cables and stuff that he has posted. So there's, it's like the next to the last entry, I think, or close to it. And it has a list of some Sacramento, like there's warrants issued for a bunch of Northern California Issei leaders. Remember, this is days before the signing of Executive Order 9066. Probably the decision was made, but the signature hadn't happened. So they're rounding up potential leaders who might not like the idea, right? That's my guess. That's my hunch. And so there's a bunch of people rounded up, and there's a misspelling that is why I did not initially find this guy. Mention of him, but there's a warrant issued for him. Once I looked for the dates, I was able to find it because I found the Alien Enemy card with his name. So he's picked up the next day, and there's a cable that says Teitsuke Takahoshi. So that's where the spelling error comes in. Of Sacramento was found in possession of 5 revolvers, 71 rounds of ammunition, 2 aerial bombs, 13 knives, 2 swords, a fencing foil, 6 military uniforms.
Interesting collection.
I know,
Yeah.
fencing well, huh?
Yeah. So, and this is just one of those things where it's like, oh. Now, you look at everybody else who was rounded up. There was like almost nothing. Like they had a revolver. They had a shotgun to, shoot at rabbits or something. And that was about it. And I tried to find out, what do they mean by aerial bombs? Like at this point, right? At this point. Right. But the military uniforms, it looks like he was probably a member of one of the Russo-Japanese War Veterans Associations, and had served in the Russo-Japanese War.
So it could very well just be a historical collection. Nothing nefarious.
It could be. And so,
yeah.
Right. And so that's the thing, is that like, I'm like, why'd they do this guy dirty? And then I find this and I'm like, oh.
Well, there's a start for sure.
Right.
It may be a misunderstanding, but it certainly is at least something.
Right. And so it's just one of those things where it may not be completely, like, but it's challenging, right? Like,
yeah.
And don't get me wrong, like looking at all the other people who were arrested, they had nothing. And that's no reason to round up 120,000 people, right? Like having one guy who had like, even if he was, right, that still doesn't make the rest of what happened okay. Mm-hmm. But it is one of those things that's so bizarre to have one of the few people. And this is the thing, is like, I've been looking at tons of other people, scanning through all these documents. Like he's like, our guy, Teisuke Takahashi, is like the only guy who had a whole bunch of weapons, and like a whole bunch.
Yeah. Which, this is all still like, other than whatever they mean by aerial bomb, it's not illegal to have that stuff.
Right. America.
Yeah. It's circumstantially not great for his case of not getting arrested in this circumstance, but like, doesn't mean that he was doing anything wrong necessarily.
Right.
But it also doesn't.
Especially at that time, it, doesn't matter.
Yeah. It doesn't prove anything one way or another, other than it does at least give us an inkling of why he might have been treated differently.
Right. And so that's the thing, is that like, I didn't come away with it like with a certainty either way. It's just, it's just challenging, right? It's just challenging to the kind of narratives I've lived with forever. And so, that's one of the last kind of tidbits I found about him when I finally was like, what else can I find? And then the one other thing, and this is where, Shigeru Nagata's story ends, is he goes to Chicago. And in 1948, there start to be sumo tournaments in Chicago. In the Chicago Shimpo, there's coverage of it. And he, in 1949, is one of the founders, Shigeru Nagata, of the Chicago Sumo Club.
I see. This is why we've had Matt Shields' name come up once or twice in our discussions.
Yeah. So this is the original Chicago Sumo Club.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So
I don't think they have quite as nice a facility as they used to.
So what's interesting about
what is this picture?
So this is the building where the Chicago Shimpo was based at the time, and where they were having like sumo kind of behind the building, I think. Like, because they're all like, hey, show up to this building. Our offices is where you sign up. Sure. This is the Borden building that later got demolished. And there's like a freeway that runs over. Like, it's like the Bayshore Parkway or whatever. Like, sure. I don't know what it's called. I don't know Chicago. But it, got taken over and demolished. But it was an old, like, robber baron, cattle. Actually, I think he was like cattle products, this Chicago. And I weirdly, as a kid, was on a like little league team that was sponsored by Borden, the cattle products company. Anyway, so
bringing us full circle.
Yeah, cow conglomerate. So yeah, so and then in 1953, I think Shigeru Nagata dies in Chicago, so he didn't return. His children, one of his sons, later moves down to Florida, and actually, according to his obituary, was one of the welders who built Walt Disney World. And then his wife and his other son, I think, and daughter moved back to San Francisco, and they go back to the Bay Area. but Shigeru Nagata dies in Chicago in the early 1950s. And then as far as I can tell, the Chicago Sumo Club kind of fades away at that point. But so many
2022, when all of a sudden, like a phoenix rising from the smelly river.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, this is the wild ride of these two guys' stories, like all from the encyclopedia. And yeah, it's just, to me, it still leaves so much more to chew on and to research. But to me, like, this experience is like why I do stuff like this, is because it's a wild ride. You don't know where it's going to take you. It might challenge your assumptions, right? Because like for me, the reason I study history is because anytime anybody asks why, the answer lies in history, right? Why are the streets the way they are? Why do we have shitty trains in America? Like anything.
Yeah.
It's history, right? Why are certain neighborhoods the way they are? Like all these questions, the answer lies in history. And to me, history is everything.
Nathan, I have to say that you did a good job holding back a lot of secrets. Even though I did see clips, I did see stuff, and I was really trying to be nice and don't dive in, but you definitely took us on a roller coaster, and I applaud you. And thank you for showing us echoes of the past.
Hell yeah. Awesome episode, guys.
Thank you. And with that, we will all say good night. Bye.
Bye. Mata ne.
Ha